Hi, this is Jody from simpleminded.life, and today we are breaking down and exploring 7 of the most popular cottage style aesthetics. So I've been doing a deep dive recently into cottage style and what defines it. I'm in the midst of a pretty big renovation. Actually, it's a full house renovation on a home that was built in the 1920s and was turned into apartments at one time, and thus lost a lot of its original character. And one of the ways I'm looking to bring that character back is to bring in some elements that feel original and cohesive, and that also add a lot of warmth and coziness to the spaces throughout the house. And I think that cottage style is one of the best ways to achieve this look. So I thought it would be fun to bring you guys along with me today as we explore 7 of the most popular and well-loved cottage styles, as well as discuss some of the qualities that define each one of those styles. And hopefully you come away with some tips and inspiration that you can use in your own home. So let's get started. So the first cottage style that we're going to take a look at together is vintage cottage. Now, if you think back, if you're a child of the 80s like me, if you think back to the 80s with the floral wallpaper, ruffle curtains, Laura Ashley, that is very much the vibe of vintage cottage. But what makes it work for today is using a fresh and updated color palette. So this style is a beautiful mix of antiques with floral wallpaper and the mid-century piece thrown into the mix here or there for good measure. However, it's a style that's definitely not stuck in the 80s. And when you use and bring in more vibrant and fresh, modern, updated colors, but still keep the throwback to the patterns and the furniture styles, then it feels a lot more updated and modern and appropriate for today. I think one of the key elements of making vintage cottage style work is keeping a lot of variety in the patterns in terms of proportion and scale. And this goes for any style for that matter. If you're going to mix the patterns, you want to mix patterns that have a fairly large scale, contrasted against those that have a smaller scale pattern, and you want to keep all the colors complementary so you don't have one pattern fighting against another. All right, the next cottage style that we're going to explore is coastal cottage, and this might be the cottage aesthetic for you if you love the feeling of being near the water and you want to bring that feeling into your home and living spaces. The color palette with coastal cottage tends to be a little bit lighter and more neutral overall from the other cottage aesthetics, and the tones tend to be on the cooler side, so you have a lot of nice soothing blues and greens thrown into the palette, which makes sense as these are colors that you would find near a lake or the ocean or another body of water. The wood tones also tend to be lighter and more washed out to echo the feeling of driftwood and the natural ebb and flow of time and water. With this cottage aesthetic, you also definitely want to incorporate a few materials that have more of a worn or rustic feeling to them. You don't want everything to be shiny and looking perfectly You don't want everything looking perfect with this style because it is a lot more relaxed. So you want to use some fabrics or textiles or wood finishes that are a little more worn and weathered. Alright, and the next cottage aesthetic that we're going to explore is the Southern cottage. The Southern cottage aesthetic places a heavy focus on providing lots of cozy, comfortable areas that are for entertaining and hanging out with family and friends. If you imagine the quintessential Southern front porch where you can sit in a rocking chair, sipping a glass of tea or wine, and there you have the perfect image of what the Southern cottage entails. Colors are still a bit more on the muted side, similar to the coastal cottage, but typically a lot more deeper and richer tones are brought into the color palette. And while the furnishings are a little on the rustic style, still there's a nice mix of more formal upholstered traditional pieces along with more rustic wood finishes. So it's a nice eclectic relaxed mix. Alrighty, next we have the English cottage. Now when a lot of us think about cottage style, the English cottage is typically what comes to mind for a lot of us. It's that time-worn, rustic but elegant architectural details, liberal use of patterns, warm colors and cozy spaces, built-in bookshelves and lots of trim and molding, and just snuggly little areas that you can cozy up with a cup of tea and a good book. I would say that the key for those of us on this side of the pond for nailing this cottage aesthetic is to incorporate lots of architectural details. And unfortunately, that is something that a lot of our homes here are missing unless you're lucky enough to live in an older home. So details you can add are crown molding, wood trim detail on the walls. That works really great. Built-in bookshelves if you are able to incorporate those. And a fairly simple thing that you can do that really does make an impact, a huge impact, even if you don't have a lot of molding and trim details in the room, is to just take your curtains all the way from the ceiling all the way down to the floor and pick a fun fabric that has a pattern or some type of trim detail, and it's amazing what that one simple thing can do to add a lot of English cottage charm and character to a space. Alright, and the next cottage aesthetic that we're going to explore is the country cottage. The country cottage aesthetic, it draws a lot more inspiration from the countryside than some of the other cottage aesthetics. So you're going to see a lot of rustic touches such as exposed brick, rustic ceiling beams, painted floors, painted furniture, a lot more textured and natural fabrics such as canvas and burlap is quite popular, as well as a lot of plaids and gingham check thrown into the mix. Now this is one style that I kind of have mixed feelings about because we've all seen it done so terribly wrong, but if you keep it on the simple side and stay away from being too literal with your decor elements. And what I mean by that is, instead of having signs that say things like fresh laid eggs or this way to the beach or family, or you get the idea. We've seen that type of decor. So stay away from literal decor pieces like that, and instead incorporate into your design actual functional pieces. So if you want to convey the idea of family and you guys like to play games together, then have a stack of games on your shelf instead of a sign or something that says family. And instead of having a sign in the restroom or in your bathroom that says "this way to the beach," collect shells and pieces of driftwood with your family when you go to the beach and put those on display. You get the idea. Just try to think of ways that you can decorate with actual objects that convey a feeling versus kind of spelling it out with a sign or other piece of decor. So that's my main tip for that one, to kind of keep it more on the sophisticated side. All right, in this next cottage style, which I love this one. This is probably my favorite cottage style next to the English cottage aesthetic, and that is French cottage. Now, I just love the French countryside. When I think of this style, I think of Provence and all the farmhouses there with the gravel courtyards and beautiful gardens and living spaces. If you're thinking of adding a bit of romance and elegance to your decor, then French cottage may be the cottage aesthetic for you. It incorporates a lot of the same timeless architectural details that the English cottage style does. So there's a lot of moldings and trim work and architectural details like that that are very classical and timeless. But it's a little bit more relaxed in my opinion, where English cottage has a tendency to be a bit more formal, still comfortable, but a little more formal in its style. With the French cottage, we tend to see more finishes that are a little bit more muted and washed out, similar to the coastal cottage style. Another key difference between the English cottage and French cottage aesthetic is that with the English cottage, you're going to see a lot of patterns in both of these cottage styles, but one way to identify each is with the English cottage style. You're going to see a lot more florals and chintzes and patterns such as that, whereas with French cottage, you're likely to find a lot more toile, ginghams, and stripes, and even plaids. So I would say in general, the patterns are a little more, aside from toile, the patterns are a little more utilitarian. I don't know if that's the right term, but they're not going to be kind of as formal and decorative as the English cottage style, which is I find that very interesting, because if we look at French fashion design through the years, the French was, and well, architectural and furniture styles as well, the French were definitely a lot more flamboyant in the past. But when it comes to cottage style, kind of ironically, it tends to be a little less formal and a little more relaxed. All right, and lastly, we have kind of the new cottage aesthetic kid on the block, and that is cottagecore. Now, this is a fairly new style across the board. It's only been around for a couple of years, and I've seen a lot of different articles and watched a few videos on this style, and some folks tend to be lumping it kind of in the same category as I would say English or French cottage, but I think the key element with cottagecore that totally makes it its own aesthetic and gives it a category all of its own is there's a heavy dose of fancifulness and romanticism and whimsy with this style. When you dream and envision what it would be like to live in the countryside and tend farm animals and frolic in a wildflower field with, I don't know, lambs and sheep and baby ducklings and chickens, you can imagine then returning home to your quaint fairy tale cottage and enjoying a picnic on the lawn. It's a very kind of dreamy, romanticized vision of what it's like to live in a cottage. So therefore, there's something that's just a little bit Disney about it. It's just a little bit, there's a little bit of fantasy to it. It's a style that I don't think that you can take too serious. You have to be willing to have fun and just go a little bit wild and maybe a little bit beyond what you would typically be comfortable with in terms of pattern and texture and color. You really can't layer and lay on too much of it with this style. This is a style that definitely would fall into the maximalist category, definitely, and it's a style where more is definitely more. In general, it's also a style that I think tends to be a bit more on the feminine side, so the colors are a little bit more romantic and just a tad more girly. There's just a lot of exuberance and fun. Alright, so there you have it. Those are 7 cottage style aesthetics that are coming back in style. A lot of us are getting tired of all the neutral farmhouse interiors. While I think there's definitely still a place for that style, I for one I love color, and I've been really excited to see color returning and the use of wallpaper, floor-to-ceiling fabric curtains, and draperies. And to me, you just can't go wrong with any of these cottage aesthetics. They're all cozy and warm and welcoming, and anyone that you want your home to be inviting and just immediately put you at ease. I don't think you can go wrong with any of these styles. With all of these styles, there are some common design elements that run through all of them. I do have a video that talks a little bit more about that. I will link that below. Happy decorating!